This is a training video about writing reports for chemistry laboratories. Report writing is one of the most important skills that you will learn in your undergraduate degree, which is why we get you to write a report for each experiment. But it doesn't need to be a difficult task. In this video, you will learn what should go into a lab report. You will need to watch this video and complete the quiz below before you can submit your first report. You can take the quiz lots of times, but you must obtain a mark of 10 out of 10 before you can continue. All report submission takes place through Blackboard. You will not be able to see the report submission folder until you have completed the quiz associated with this video. You must also read and check the plagiarism acknowledgement before you can submit a report. Once you have done that, the report submission folder will appear. Inside that folder, you will find folders for each experiment. And inside each folder, you will find Turnitin drop boxes. You must take care to submit your report to the correct folder and Dropbox. If you do not do this, your report will not be marked on time and you may lose marks. Submit your report by clicking on View or Complete for the correct folder. This is what the report submission folder looks like. You can view the marking rubric by clicking here, and this is what you will see. When you want to submit your report, click on this button. The report submission folder is also where you come to view feedback for reports that have already been marked. Once you've uploaded your report, you will receive an email confirmation. It's your responsibility to ensure that you have received this email confirmation. If you have not, then make sure you have correctly uploaded your report. After your report has been marked, you can access it from the Turnitin folder and see your feedback. There are two ways of getting feedback. First, you will notice that there are comments on your report. If we zoom in, you can see that the comments are either speech bubbles or short phrases. You can hover over these to see the comments beneath. The second way to get feedback is to click on the rubric symbol on the bottom right-hand corner. This will bring up the breakdown of your marks for the report. So that's how you can get feedback through Turnitin. Make sure you do check your report feedback to make sure that you can improve for next time. For the rest of this video, we're going to go through the sections in the report and see what is expected for each one. This training is going to be based on an example experiment which involves the synthesis and study of fluorescent molecules called coumarins. An example report for this experiment is on Blackboard just under the video. This training will give examples of what to do and what not to do. Even though the experiments that you do will be very different, all reports have a similar structure, so we're going to look at common aspects of all reports. First, the introduction. The introduction should be a brief background to the report. It should include a few sentences about the techniques used or the compounds made in this experiment, and why this is significant. It should end with a summary of what was specifically done in this experiment. Let's look at an example. In this example introduction, you can see that first, there are a few sentences about why fluorescence and fluorescent molecules are important. There are then a couple of sentences about the specific molecules, the coumarins, used in this experiment. And finally, there is a summary sentence about what was done in this experiment. The experimental method is an extremely important part of a lab report. The method should be a brief description of what you did in the experiment. It should be written in the passive past tense, and we'll see examples of that on the next slide. It should not be written like an instruction list, like a recipe, but it should be a narrative of what you actually did in the experiment. Do not include details of glassware, but make sure you show quantities of the substances that you used. It's important that someone reading your experimental method should be able to repeat the experiment. Let's have a look at an example experimental method. Notice that the experimental method is written in paragraph form, not in a list. Let's have a look at the first phrase. Notice that it doesn't say, "I heated sulfuric acid." Instead, it says, "Sulfuric acid was heated." This is because experimental methods should be written in the passive third person. Now notice how we write the quantities of substances. The amount, that is the mass or the volume, followed by the number of moles or millimoles, is written in brackets after the substance. You should also pay careful attention to the way you write units. You should always use a capital L for litres or millilitres, and make sure you leave a space between the number and the unit. In the lab manual, you will be told the results that you need to include for each experiment. Do not just list the things asked for, but include a narrative text to link the results. Importantly, you should refer to all figures and tables in the narrative. And remember that all figures must have a figure legend below the figure, and all tables must have a table heading above the table. Let's look at part of a results section. Here you can see the narrative text. Notice that it refers to both the table and the figure below. Here you can see the table heading for the table above the table, and the figure caption below the figure. See how all the details of the figure are in the caption. Also notice the units on the figure and in the table headings. As an advanced student, you are expected to replot your data using Excel or some other graphing software for insertion into your report. This means that it is no longer sufficient for you to just take a photograph or to scan in the printout that you get from the instrument. Instead, you need to save the data in the correct format, whether that's a CSV file or a text file, and then save it onto a memory stick for processing later. So make sure that you bring a memory stick with you to the lab and ask a demonstrator if you're not quite sure how to save the data in the correct format. An important thing to remember when you look at your marks for results is that up to 40% of the total report mark comes from the experimental results themselves. This is because we need to assess your ability in the lab and what you've actually performed during the laboratory session, and not just your ability to write a report. So for synthetic labs, this might be yield or appearance or purity, and for analytical labs, this will be how close your measured quantity is to the correct answer. Let's move on to the discussion section now. Again, in the lab manual, you will be told the discussion points that you need to include for each experiment. You do not need to restate the question above each discussion point. You should work the question into your answer. You don't need to use too much space to answer each point. One paragraph should be sufficient. Here is an example of what not to do in a discussion. Comment on your yield is a fairly common discussion question, as it is something that you should consider after every synthesis. In cases where you are asked to comment on your results, whether it is precision or accuracy or yield or purity, you should try to present two reasonable explanations based on your experimental technique. Don't just blame the equipment or the students around you. There are probably things that you could improve in your technique. So you should be able to see why the answer given here is not sufficient. For a start, it's written in the first person, and it only provides one, not very good explanation for the loss of yield. So make sure you keep this in mind when you have discussion questions like this to comment on. The conclusions, again, should be brief, but should be a clear summary of the experiment and its value. Start with a brief summary of what this experiment was about. Then have a sentence or two drawing out what your results show you, and then end with a sentence identifying the importance of the experiment itself or of the experimental result. Here is an example. First, we have a sentence summarizing what was done in this experiment. Then we have a sentence summarizing the conclusions that we could draw about the effects of structure on color. Finally, we have a sentence summarizing why the results obtained here are important for the application of this type of chemistry. The final mark for the report is an overall mark. We expect you to be able to produce a report that is free from grammatical and spelling errors, so make sure you proofread your report before you upload it. You should make sure that your use of chemical symbols, chemical names, and significant figures is correct. You should also take care with the layout. Make sure that your report has a title and that each section has a heading.
Where you find information from other sources, it is important to reference this information and to provide references, particularly for statements that you make in the introduction, discussion, and conclusions. Referencing will be compulsory for advanced and SSP reports. There are many different referencing styles, but we ask that you use the ACS guidelines for intermediate and senior chemistry. You can find these guidelines in the referencing file in the appendices folder. It is particularly important that you maintain consistency through all your referencing. It's important to remember that Wikipedia is not a sufficient reference to use. It is not a primary source of information. Make sure that you try to find original primary sources of information, preferably textbooks or journal articles.
Here you can see an example of part of a paragraph from the discussion section of a report. And you can see that the final sentence refers to literature reported values. This of course requires a literature reference. The ACS style uses numbered sequential numbers throughout the text to refer to references, and here you can see the 3 is the reference number. Reference numbers should be placed after the punctuation mark, and they should be superscript. And here you can see what the reference section of your report looks like. It should be a separate section, it shouldn't be an endnote or a footnote, and use the similar heading to the headings you use for the other subsections. Pay careful attention to the style that you use. Make sure that you refer back to the referencing style which is outlined in the appendix.
In week 1, all students must complete experiment 1. You should complete the quiz below this video and obtain a mark of 10 out of 10 before you can submit your report. You will find that the report submission folder is hidden for you until you complete this quiz. The report will be due 1 week after the lab session, and at that point we will assign peer marking. This report will not be marked by demonstrators or by academics, but it will undergo a peer marking exercise. The reason we're doing this is that we want you to be able to recognise essential components and good and bad styles of writing for reports. This is a summative assessment only. As long as you complete the report and complete your peer marking assignment, you will obtain full marks for the report section for experiment 1.